Frustration in the workplace is a common experience. How can having better conversations help? This will be the topic of our next session, in which Zoe Cunningham, director at Softwire, and Jeffrey Fredrick, who is managing director at Team, an Acuris company, will discuss how we can gain the skills of Agile Conversations and transform our culture. And remember that you can ask Jeffrey your own questions on Crowdcast using the Ask a Question button that you should see at the bottom of your screen. Enjoy the Fireside chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Fireside chat, where we are going to be discussing getting the most from your conversations. Just so you know, this session will be recorded, and feel free to add questions at any time, and I will cover them in a Q&A at the end. So I'm Zoe Cunningham, hello, and I'll be moderating today's session. I am a lifelong technologist and I'm a director at Softwire. I'm also, slightly more confusingly and more recently, I'm also a filmmaker and an actor, and I feel like actor and coder are almost like the opposite of each other. Anyway, I'm always up for meeting other. If you're also an actor and a coder and you're like, oh my God, then drop me a line. Anyway, and with me today is Jeffrey Fredrick, who is the managing director at Tim, a fintech company in London. He's also an executive coach, host of the podcast Troubleshooting Agile, and author of the book Agile Conversations. Hello, Jeffrey.
Hi, Zoe.
So let's start at the beginning. What do you mean by Agile Conversations? So is this a term that you created?
It is. And what we meant was something to go back to kind of the original idea of Agile, which is about sort of the human interaction to be able to respond to change. And so we definitely meant this in a double entendre sort of way. There's the element of the kind of, for people who want to be Agile, who want to have an Agile company or Agile team or any of that, then these are conversations that we think are critical to actually achieving Agile ends. So I say we because I have a co-author, Douglas Squirrel. He'll also be speaking at the conference later in the week. But in our coaching and our work with people, we often come across people who are frustrated that they're doing everything by the book. They're following all the recipes, but they're not getting the results. And for us, we're saying, well, you're missing a human element here. Very often, that's the most common case is that they've treated humans like they're fixed pieces and they can follow a recipe. And humans are much more dynamic than that. And that's part of the agility that we have. And this is kind of the other half, which is to be, that sort of responding in the moment, responding to what you find. And there's a link between that kind of agility and the agility of when people are trying to be Agile in their software or Agile in their company.
Sure, I could not agree with that more. This idea of, people are not, they're not the same as each other to start with. So you can't be like, oh, I added another developer. They'll behave like the last developer. Okay, so that's great. That's obviously something we need to talk about. But what exactly are you proposing in your book? Is this something where we have to train ourselves in a certain way to behave?
Well, fundamentally, the answer to that is yes. when we say have to, you don't. It's not really true. You don't have to, because there is an option, and that option is called getting lucky. It turns out when you put people together and have them talk to each other, you can get lucky, and they can have a very productive conversation. And I've been part of teams where we got lucky and we were put together and, we had a shared project in certain circumstances and for whatever the chemistry clicked. And we had great conversations and we could solve problems together. And it was a great dynamic that we created amongst ourselves without really knowing what we were doing. And this is, I think, what people often experience. And a lot of the cargo cult recommendations that you'll get, like have a 2-pizza team, have a co-located team. These are things. These are structures you can put in place that make you more likely to get lucky, because they work with the way humans think, the way they operate, and the sort of the natural empathy, and these things will work, or they won't. And that's the problem, and is that when you aren't lucky, when that group doesn't have the right dynamics. If all you know is luck, then you're out of luck. And what we say is there's an alternative, which is actually having effective conversations is a learnable skill. And I focus more on learnable rather than teachable, because actually it's the effort that you put in. Because conversations are a skill like any other skilled activity, they require practice. And what we lay out in the book is how to practice having better conversations, both in general, that's chapter 2. We talk about being transparent and curious, and how these are what everyone already espouses, what everyone in our audience already believes, that if they want to have an effective teamwork, then they want transparency and curiosity. Everyone believes this, and everyone actually typically believe that they do act this way. Unfortunately, you don't in practice. And I say you don't in a sort of categorical sense because this is about human nature. Humans have certain built-in cognitive biases that lead us to be unproductive. So even though we know that the best results come from being transparent and curious, as soon as there's the potential for a threat or embarrassment, we start having a defensive reasoning and a defensive mindset. And we start judging people differently. We withhold information. We see differences of opinion now as a threat rather than as an opportunity to learn. And this is just baked into us. What we have found and what the science says is that we can learn other ways of behaving. And we provide essentially the steps that it takes to do that, which involves some very simple tools, which is a piece of paper and a pencil. People always ask, can I do it on my computer? Yes, you can do this work on your computer. The important thing is you cannot do it in your head. The key step here is about getting the conversation out of your head onto a paper in a structured format that you can then learn from. As humans, we actually have tremendous capacity for understanding people. And unfortunately, it's like a microscope in that it's really hard to put the microscope under the microscope. When those thoughts are in your head, they're actually not available for you to use those mechanisms. There's part of your brain that gets activated whenever the conversation's about you, and it interferes with how you perceive what's happening. By getting it out on a paper or in your computer and analyzing it that way, you now have achieved something called self-distancing. And that bit of a gap allows you to start bringing these other skills to play and applying them to yourself. And then you suddenly, for the first time, start to understand how you're contributing to the problems that have made you frustrated. So that's the this is if you want to. Do you have to learn these skills? No, you can get lucky. You can remain frustrated, or you can learn these skills.
Sure, and I think that that's definitely a situation that I relate to, and I'm sure anyone who's watching who's been a manager will have some moment where they were just like, hold on, I think my behavior just didn't match up to what I wanted my behavior to be. And you can often just feel very lost at that point, a bit like, oh my God, what do I do? So it's great to have tools. And I think once that has happened to you as a manager, the motivation obviously to do this is going to be there for sure. So can you give me an example then? What is, because we talked about, you do it on pen and paper, you get it out of your head, but what is an example of what this would go like?
Sure. So in the book, we cover 5 different specific conversations, and each one has a particular tool that you might analyze your conversation with. The first tool that we talk about is something called the ladder of inference, and this is for the trust conversation. And what you would do, and I just did a session recently, I would get a piece of paper and I would fold it in half. So I have 2 columns. And then on the right-hand side, I record the dialogue back and forth. They said, I said, they said, I said. And then I went through, and after recording the conversation, I then reflected on it, meaning I scored it using the tool. In this case, I was sort of saying the ladder of inference is sort of the process we go to mentally in a conversation. We hear something, we make meaning from those words. We have assumptions, we come to conclusions, and finally beliefs about the world, and then we speak. and this usually happens instantaneously. And the ladder of interest is a tool to help understand, where am I speaking from? Am I talking from the top of my ladder in sort of conclusion language? We should do this, we should do that. Or am I talking from the bottom of my ladder? I saw this, I saw that. I think this means this. I'm worried there's a risk because of this other thing. Are we sharing our reasoning? So that coding helps me understand, how transparent was I? Was I sharing those elements? And also, when I was talking to the person, did I ask them about their own process? Did I ask them, well, what have you seen? What led you to believe that? Rather than simply at the top of our ladder saying, well, you're wrong. Which that's what comes readily. That's our instantaneous thought. That's silly. And so this kind of reflection, I'd say, okay, now, having coded this and said, well, yeah, I was talking at the top of my ladder, I wasn't very curious, I then would revise my conversation and try to come up with better examples, and I would write it out. And that revision process is where I develop my skills and practice. Like, well, what could I have said differently? How might I have been curious? And that practice helps me build those muscles so that I'm more likely to do it. It gives me more options. So in the moment next time, I have some ideas planned out. And ideally, I'm doing this kind of practice with someone else. And I can do the very best kind of practice, which is role play. And then I can practice saying these words to someone. Because it often comes that I write something out and I think it's great, and I try to say it and I go, actually, no, I don't speak that way. No human speaks that way. Or then we also get to role reversal, to have the other person say my dialogue back to me. And that's often also enlightening. It's like, I felt great saying that. I hated the way it sounded when it was said back to me, back to the revision, and that's the process. So we kind of work through this. It doesn't take very long. I do this, these public dojos for people to practice their conversations. I'll be doing one tonight at a meetup, and I'll give people 6 minutes to record their conversation. Scoring it takes about 3. Doing your revision takes another 5 or 6. Role playing takes a few minutes. So this is something that's easily doable in a half hour, with a group of people over lunchtime, which is where I had a lot of practice developing these with coworkers.
Brilliant. So I have so many questions. However, we've already got questions coming in from the audience, and I think it's more important that you answer their questions. So first up, from Steve, what is the biggest cognitive bias we should overcome in our work?
That's great.
Other than obviously having the right amount of pizza.
I think the biggest cognitive bias, the most damaging, is naive realism. And naive realism is the idea that or I'll personalize it, that I see the world directly. And this illusion that my eyes are like video cameras and I'm just taking everything in. And that's not the way our brains work, right? We see what we expect to see. We suffer from amazing selection bias. So all the time we're finding the data that supports things we already believe, and we're omitting the things that would be surprising to us. So other people see different things, then we think they're clearly wrong because it's obvious to us that we've seen reality. And this naive realism goes to say, what I see is real. My conclusions are therefore correct. And they're not just correct, they're obviously correct, which means anyone who doesn't agree with me is either ignorant or malicious, like they're deliberately taking an opposing view. So that, I think, is the one of the most difficult biases to overcome, because it kind of encapsulates so many negative consequences for our conversations.
And it can just get you on so many levels, can't it? Like, you have it, and then you're like, no, I'm doing my Agile Why aren't you listening to my Agile
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's how it shows up for me. So we have another question from Sachin, and I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. So what are the strategies on addressing bias, defensive mechanisms in a remote working environment? So this is super interesting, right? Because we're all a lot of us are now in this new environment we weren't in before, and some people have been in this environment all along and not getting treated as equals. So how do we deal with that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think one of the benefits of remote environments, so we lose a lot, and we lose a lot of these sort of human interactions that help us build bonds, and particularly the most valuable bond that we get when we're in person is the things we do when we're not in the meeting. When we're, say, before the meeting, talking about how people take their tea. Those sort of like small social interactions build a rapport that allow us to be a bit braver about what we say, a little bit more curious about what we ask. When we're remote and people are two-dimensional, we often lose that. There is an advantage, though, which is a lot of people do understand, well, this is harder. We're going to have to make accommodations because we are remote. And so those become opportunities for us to be more explicit in overcoming our biases. So, for example, being more explicit about turn-taking in conversations, to be more explicit about how we're going to make sure we get everyone's input, how are we going to make sure we keep everyone engaged in this conversation. So I think that there are some very good opportunities there. And I think also we have more of an opportunity to frame the conversation in a way that's conducive to learning and participation. And framing is one of the most important elements a leader can do. And I got this from Amy Edmondson, who people may know as the person who coined the term psychological safety. And she described this in her book, Teaming, that if you want people to come together and feel safe to relate, you need the leader to set a learning frame. Look, we have this challenge. It's going to be difficult. I can't do it alone. We need all of your help. When you see something, I need you to speak up. And I think that kind of framing is something that is always helpful. And I think it's especially helpful in a remote environment because people are aware that this is more difficult. And so I think it allows us to set this learning frame saying, look, we're all out of our comfort zone now. To have us all work effectively, we're going to need to make sure we are getting everyone's input here. So we're going to try some different processes. And when you have the urge, like maybe I should speak up or should I not? We really want to hear what you have to say. When you have questions, we really want to have them ask them. It will be harder for you to do it because we're remote, but it's all the more important that we hear from you. So that kind of framing, I think, is very valuable in this remote context.
And also it gives you almost like this inbuilt excuse to ask, like, what would make it work for you? What would make you ask your questions more in this environment? Yes. Fantastic. So you're talking in this approach of kind of overcoming your instincts. So, we have cognitive biases and then we're going to overcome them. Are there any situations in which actually it's helpful to go with your instincts or use your instincts rather than throwing them away, as it were?
It's a great question, and the best answer I have is if someone shouts fire, and you're in the theater. I mean, not that any of us are in the theater these days, but if there's a fire, you don't ask people, "Hey, I see there's a fire. I wonder how you feel about it. I'm really curious now." Just to share my letter of inference, I think fire could die in a fire. Don't want to die. I'd like to leave, but I'm open to other ideas. So in those kind of emergency situations, I think there are other. We should go with our instinct, but that's rare. That's really rare, and it's very tempting. And I think this is people often fall into the idea saying, "We don't have time for this. We're in a hurry. We're urgent." But actually, you're not in that kind of life or death situation, and you will save time from productive conversations. You will save time through clarity. So it's one of the things, sort of like quality. Like if you're in a hurry, make sure you build in quality. It's the same thing in your conversations. If you're in a hurry, make sure you're having quality conversations.
Right, so that you get the right information the first time, not having to cycle round and or have someone misunderstand and then have to maybe even do everything again.
Which is the most common case. And there's many lovely disaster tales, like when two airplane companies had a different idea of what the word deliver meant. And it turned out that things go bad in that case. So
it's incredible. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I could talk about this topic all day. I think it's such a deep topic and there is so much scope to discuss more. But everyone, please do ask Jeffrey your questions on Slack. He said he's happy to answer them there in the conference channel. And thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.